Welcome back to Seek Strength and welcome back to Seek Stands National S&C Coaches React to S&C work by professional athletes. Today we're doing Mikaela Shiffrin, who is an Alpine ski racer. Now, Mikaela is by and large, and what it seems to be, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Alpine ski racers ever. Mikaela was brought to our attention by one of the previous comments on the last S&C Coaches reaction we did. So before we get going, any athlete immediately comes to your mind, you leave them in the comments down below, because we get loads of great athletes from those, and it lets us find out a lot of great athletes from that and make more of these videos. So if you're biased to your particular sport, bang it in below, bang it down below.
Get it in there.
We'll hang on a second. Okay, Mikaela Shiffrin, Alpine skier. She is 5-time overall World Cup champion, a 4-time world champion in the slalom, and a 7-time winner of the World Cup discipline in the slalom event. So there's 2 different events, and one of them is slalom from what we gather. Now, usually when we come across a sport for S&C, there's a good chance we've already dealt with an athlete in that sport, or we have dealt with an athlete very closely related in those sports, or we've thought about that sport before. Alpine skiing actually isn't one of the sports we've dealt with in terms of just sports in general. We don't get a lot of winter sports.
No, we really don't.
So usually, before we do videos like this, we'll do a little investigation into the literature. The good thing about S&C coaching and being an S&C coach is that the principles of S&C are general. You apply general S&C principles. You do an assessment of that athlete and their sport, of what they might need, and then take that general principles and then tailor it to some specifics to that athlete's S&C. So by and large, most athletes' S&C looks like most athletes' S&C, but then certain sections are tailored. More of it looks similar than would be different. And if anyone's trying to sell you, before we get going, if anyone's trying to sell you on something that looks crazy different to anyone else, especially in well-established sports,
absolutely,
your alarm bells, your red flags should be raising.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, there's 2 things that come up in the literature. One is Alpine skiers get injured a lot.
Yeah.
At all levels, and compared to pretty much any other sports, they get lots of injuries. And where do you think most of the injuries were, Fitz?
I think most of the injuries were in the lower limbs.
In the lower limbs. So we're seeing a lot of knee injuries. And one of the other things then, so kind of attributes that Alpine ski racers are kind of known for or needed for, if we look at kind of some of the literature, the meta reviews, and if you look at what appears most often, it's generally, first of all, injury prevention, or that's one of the main goals of an S&C coach in Alpine skiing. And then you're looking at producing or increasing qualities that look like power production, lower body power production, postural strength, power endurance, and then just good old-fashioned aerobic and some anaerobic capacities.
Yeah, I think they need to be very well-rounded athletes, generally. I think the lower body stuff is definitely something, as we go and look at the videos of her training, we'll definitely see a kind of high prevalence of the lower body work. But it's very much the same as kind of some of the speed skating stuff. It's very quad and glute dominant. It's very much a kind of holding yourself in there as much as you possibly can in these kind of really high stress, high force environments.
If you had to distill it down further, Alpine skiing is change of direction. If you were to look at it from other sports or other characteristics from other sports like field sports, change of direction, hugely attributed to power production, but also just good old-fashioned force production, aka being strong, ability to apply force. And that comes from strength training specifically, and very often in most sports, in the lower limbs.
For anyone looking at this as a kind of direct mode or how that sport might interact with training, if you imagine every time you go around a corner, all of that weight being taken on one leg, that kind of outside leg or the uphill leg being lifted off the floor, and then that outside leg becoming the kind of next inside leg or the downhill leg next, you've massive amounts of force just going on one leg down through one hip, knee and ankle. And then obviously that force is being moved around a lot as well. So your snow surface isn't straight. You might have moguls. You're also turning. The camber and the slant of the hill won't be the same. So there is a lot of variables in something like the slalom.
I think the amount of recreational skiers every year who get injured is probably a good indicator of how intense the sport is. I think if on the slopes, you see a lot of people getting carried off. So Mikaela's Instagram has quite a bit of recency over the last couple of years, or quite a good selection. As always, this is a snapshot and is essentially out of context. So when we're doing this, we are making some kind of guesses, or we're making some extrapolations based on what they're doing and what we think it might be for, or what we think of that in that particular scenario. So there's always that asterisk that we're never harassing anyone. And we only do people, of course, who have good S&C. We don't like doing terrible S&C because it's just not good vibes.
No, there's never a hit job in someone's S&C training.
No hit jobs in S&C training. So first up, what we see a lot and frequently throughout the years from Mikaela's training is some front squats.
Yeah, I think front squats make perfect sense in this case for this sport. Very quad dominant, also really going to kind of tax that postural stuff with the mid and upper back, and you're going to get a lot of anterior core work in there as well. When you start looking at those positions, the kind of crouched in position that you'd see from those skiers isn't all that far away from what you get during the front squat. Obviously, we don't need to be emulating those positions exactly, but they're certainly training those same kind of modes of action, certainly training those same muscle groups that you would use while skiing.
So what you see here as well is Mikaela seems to be doing this as part of a larger circuit, and your immediate thought might be, oh, is that kind of stupid? Are you reducing the effectiveness of her training? So the answer is kind of no, and also it doesn't really matter. For example, if we just look at the circuit style aspect, if anyone has coached underage teams or younger teams of athletes, you'll know that the most important thing is to keep them occupied at all times. So you're moving them generally through different circuits. If you have 20 or 25 rugby players in a gym, you're going to have them being active, either critiquing another athlete, watching them, doing a particular paired set of opposing muscle groups or unrelated muscle groups like we have Mikaela doing here. So she's doing her front squats and then she's moving on to her single leg dumbbell rows, and it's largely doesn't really diminish a huge amount of the effectiveness of the exercise. So she's doing her kettlebell swings, and realistically she's a well-trained athlete, she's of high caliber, she's obviously in very good condition all year round. So in reality, this isn't going to massively affect the strength outcomes of these exercises. You know, she doesn't necessarily need a huge 1RM. While it is beneficial if she could get there without destroying herself in training, it's not exactly necessary.
Yeah, I think that is a really good caveat to the superset thing, or the kind of the multi-exercise sets, if you want to call them circuits or whatever. People oftentimes will compare that to their own experience, and they'll say, oh, if I'm squatting in the gym, or if I want to do my best set of front squats in the gym, and I was to do something like kettlebell swings in between, or in this case, the kind of single leg RDL hold while you're doing the row. In those cases, if you're a standard athlete, normal kind of genetic potential, that's going to fatigue you in some way. When you get more elite athletes working with, in their case, sub-maximal weights, that's not going to do anything to them. Like in her case, she's the best, or what we consider to be one of the best skiers. That kind of fatigue isn't really going to have any effect on what is massively sub-maximal for her.
So also supersets as well, like this, are very good for just a little bit extra work capacity and some more extra caloric expenditure, and most amateur athletes could probably benefit from that. So it might be no harm, and you'll know if you've done any of our programs, you'll see a lot of the times the assistance work for both time management but also for the extra benefits are superset paired depending on what's there. So again, we just a lot more front squats, so these appeared very frequently throughout her training history from what we can see in the S&C. Always in made-to-fit shoes, always with a clean grip, interestingly enough. To be honest with her, I wouldn't really favour the clean grip. I think you'd probably just more likely putting a little bit of demand on the wrists. If I was doing anything, it'd probably just be back squats and belt squats preferably. But if it was front squats, it'd either be with straps where you just keep your elbows up, or it would be the more traditional bodybuilder or powerlifter who can't rack a barbell style front squat as opposed to clean grip front squats.
One interesting thing here when you look at her front squatting is that super neutral head position. So this would be more along the lines of what you'd see like a physiotherapist prescribing, or a kind of exercise or rehab specialist prescription, where you get very, very neutral head positions. This would be the same if they were deadlifting. They wouldn't be looking straight ahead. They'd be kind of looking almost down at the floor. Very, very neutral, where that ear is straight over the top of the base of our neck, and the nose would be straight out at 90 degrees to the torso. So it is, most of the time you start getting into kind of more elite athletes, they'll have that chin up slightly, they'll have a slightly more kind of extended upper back. But it all kind of comes down to personal preference, or more importantly, it comes down to coaching preference. In this case, obviously in the skier's case, they're not going to have massive weight on the front squats, so that kind of super extended position probably isn't needed.
Then we have a whole host of split squats. We see these appearing very frequently as well. Now, Bulgarian split squats have become very popular in the general fitness culture for their ass building properties, which of course is one of the most popular things at the moment in the general fitness industry, or in the recreational athlete, or the health and lifestyle, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to an athlete like Mikaela, she's looking for a lot of unilateral balance to ensure good performance, but also what seems to be emerging in the literature, and it does seem to be, it makes sense logically, but we can't always use that what appears to be logical from the outside when it comes to inferring kind of outcomes to particular parameters, is that unilateral imbalances from side to side, once they get beyond a certain level of difference from side to side, seem to predispose an athlete to slightly worse performance and potentially more injury. And that makes sense, because if one side is taking more of the load, the tissue is either going to be under more stress and more likely to experience an issue in terms of the tissue degrading or the joints taking more load, or it could be one side gets stronger, the less dominant side, then tissues aren't able to keep up, and then you'd meet an adverse event, and then they experience a ACL rupture or meniscus tear or any number of issues that we're talking about the lower body. So when it comes to single leg training, one of the best exercises really is a Bulgarian split squat loaded with a barbell in the back squat rack position. It's nice and safe. It's very consistent. It's very single leg dominant. You get a nice stretch in the hip flexors in the back, which is beneficial for most people, and specifically for an alpine skier like her, who's always going to be in a shortened hip flexor position. It is very, very useful to move it through a weighted range of motion. And from then the barbell back squat position, you're not overly demanding the posterior or the upper back, and then you can load it incrementally in a repeatable fashion, nice and safely.
Yeah, I think there's two things you could probably note from this particular set, or from watching the Bulgarian split squats here. So the first thing is the range of motion she's going through is not good, or it doesn't appear to be end range of motion. Very, very commonly see people really trying to get that back knee, that rear leg to touch the ground. That really isn't something you ever require. And to do that, a lot of the time we start seeing people inclining forward with the torso. So in this case, very, very nice posture. That torso angle remains consistent throughout, and that back leg is basically going through a range of motion where it's kind of comfortable, or it's safe the entire time. So definitely, if you are in the camp of people who are going to start using Bulgarian split squats, we don't need to see that back leg being rooted to the ground, and we definitely don't want to see any kind of forward inclination of the torso. A very, very good marker to have is, you'll see on her squat safety bars, there appears to be something hanging down on the closer bar to us. That barbell stays tracked over that marker for the entire time. And that's a really good thing for you to watch, is make sure our barbell isn't drifting forward or retreating backwards as you start to sit down into the bottom of that Bulgarian. This is a very, very nice straight bar path. Kind of ensures that front leg is getting most of the load.
So on top of the split squats, we also see a lot of upper body training. So when it comes to upper body, we're looking at posterior strength. So in terms of maintaining a good position while she is skiing downhill, you want to maintain that posture. You don't want to lose those positions. We don't see any deviation in the lower back, for example, which might change our ability to output power when we're moving from side to side or changing direction. And we see a lot of pull-ups, push-ups, and it could easily go maybe unthought of or left to the wayside a little bit in terms of the upper body training for someone like a alpine skier. So again, more front squats, featuring very frequently, never massively heavy, which I think is appropriate. Then we've more Bulgarian split squats. Next up then, we have some heavy kettlebell swings.
Yeah, so I really like kettlebell swings generally for athletes. Really, really good tool. They're a good tool for some kind of local muscular endurance. They're also a good tool for that slightly higher power output. Most of the time, if we're using a heavy enough kettlebell, you're going to have to put in a fair amount of force. It'll have to be a fairly explosive movement to kind of get that hip to open up so the kettlebell will swing out and away from us. I think in the case of a sport like skiing, where you're constantly going down into that crouched over, that hip flexion position, it's very, very important that you're training these muscle groups not only to be very strong and powerful, but added on to that, you need to have a fairly good level of kind of local muscular endurance. You need to have a fairly good level of kind of critical power output, where we're going to be able to maintain these positions. It probably isn't an isometric hold for most of it. You'll be kind of coming up and down, getting in and out of positions as you're coming into corners and going out of corners. It's very important you're able to do that repeatably, and that by the time you get to that last turn, you're not kind of very, very slow coming up. So I think these are perfectly suited for the sport.
Next, in the posterior development, so on top of those glute swings, those goblet swings, we have got some band-resisted trap bar deadlifts. In this case, I don't really think the band resistance makes any particular difference. It adds anything major other than just extra resistance to pull against. So these are RDLs with a trap bar or stiff-legged deadlifts, probably RDLs realistically. So just usually used for hamstring or glute development, which again are obviously very useful in hip and knee extension. So the hamstrings are involved in both those joints extension. So it's very important obviously to train those. It's also very useful in terms of knee health and their ability, of course, then to again change that direction. So posterior strength hinging would be very, very useful, while also give you an opportunity to maintain a good position throughout the upper body.
I think an interesting note on these is the use of a hex bar versus a normal straight bar for something like the RDL. When you give RDLs to people with a straight bar, they immediately have, or even stiff-legged deadlifts, they immediately have this kind of physical feedback, this kinesthetic feedback as the barbell is touching the fronts of their legs. So as you come down out of that upright position, as you come down and start to push your feet back, you'll see a lot of athletes will kind of allow the bar to drift away from themselves, and they'll start kind of semi-pulling it back into them, pushing their hips back more to get the barbell back in touch with their legs. I think in this case it allows you to kind of really refine the position they're in without having that kind of direct physical feedback of somebody understanding this is the end of the rep because the barbell has pushed against this point of my shins.
So lastly, on the kind of strength focus aspect of our workouts, we've got one of our favorite exercises is Nordic falls. A lot of times most people can't do a full repetition of these. A lot of times these are done as assisted, maybe band assisted, or as a slow eccentric until you can't hold it any longer. So these are incredibly useful for hamstring development. They're fantastic at isolating it. You don't get a lot of external loading on these, so it can be quite low impact after a certain period of time once you get used to them. If you're not used to them and you go do them, you are going to destroy your hamstrings for a couple of days. But they're a great hamstring developer, and to a certain extent posterior developer as well, or in terms of like maintaining your posture during a full range of motion movement. What a lot of times you'll see people do these with is they'll start out nice and proud and they'll have a big chest, and then they'll fall forward, and as soon as they either lose position, they'll hinge forward, drop their chest and push themselves up, which is okay. But a lot of times people immediately begin the rep with their chest forward, their shoulders in front of their hips, and then they lean forward and essentially aren't really getting any or very little use out of that exercise.
Yeah, I think one of the main things, if you're coaching these or if you're observing your own videos, is that the hamstring Nordic should always be initiated with the hips. So we start with our hips pushed forward, our glutes pushed forward, and then we're thinking about the kind of waistband at the front of our shorts or tracksuit pants being the first thing to hit the ground. Now, in reality, it's not going to be the first thing to hit the ground, but that's how you should really be thinking about Nordic hamstring falls or Nordic hamstring curls, is that we're initiating with the hip. All too often, as Gerf said, we see the ass kicking back. We're in this kind of semi-flex position. We feel like you're doing great work, but you're really not. The main thing I'd like to draw people's attention to here is that Mikaela has a pretty legitimate setup here, right? So there's one of those Reebok Step Aerobics boxes with two spacers underneath. There looks like there's two mats on top of her box, and then there's a bench at the correct height. One of the main things when coaching people I've seen with the Nordics is that they really don't spend long enough in the setup, and they'll have a kind of semi-Jimmy rig together setup. You don't need anything fancy. You certainly don't even need a full GHD for these. But taking that extra 2 or 3 minutes to get the extra yoga mat, to bring the bench out so you're not falling all the way to the floor, small things like this will make a massive difference to the quality of work you'll get done and the overall quantity of work you'll get done when you're doing your Nordics.
Now, we actually have a great example of one of the useful ways of doing those if you have the time and opportunity to set up a regression of the Nordic falls, and that is the use of a resistance band to support you and allow you to control the eccentric a little bit slower. Now, these shouldn't be used for too long a period of time, so don't get into the habit of using these as a crutch. If you're incredibly poor at the control initially, so if you start out doing your Nordic falls and you can't control yourself through any range of motion, so as soon as you begin the descent you lose all control, this is a good regression for a reasonable period of time. We're talking 3 to 6 weeks. Then you should move on and remove the band as kind of promptly as possible. What happens a lot of time is people will use resistance bands for things like this, or they'll use things like maybe push-ups or more commonly pull-ups, and very frequently never really progress beyond the use of pull-ups. A very guilty case in this would be generally people doing CrossFit, and the initial beginner stage they'll use the resistance bands. They might even reduce the thickness and assistance size of the band, but realistically will never give themselves an opportunity to perform the movement or attempt to perform the movement unassisted. So for doing this, great opportunity for the first couple of weeks to practice those and not immediately go into the hamstring destruction, and give yourself a little opportunity to control the movement, practice the technique correctly. But then after that, after a couple of weeks, move as quickly to that controlled range of motion as little as possible, or as little as you can do it. Doesn't matter how little. If you can only control yourself for the first 10 degrees of movement, that's fine. You will build up the tolerance eventually, but don't spend too long with the resistance bands if you are going to attempt these. But that said, they are useful for the initial few weeks once you remove them, and don't let them become a crutch.
These reps are phenomenally good.
Yeah,
They're so good.
That band is incredibly small as well.
Yeah.
That's kind of the band you use when you're doing like face pulls or something.
One thing I would like, if you know of female athletes with better Nordic falls than this, I'd love to see them in the comments down below. These are incredibly well controlled.
I assume there's some Mongolian wrestler who can do weighted ones of those. Now, next up, we've got kind of a little bit of the conditioning aspect of her training. Rather, this is more of a wind gate test or actual attribute testing.
Yeah, this actually makes my soul hurt looking at this. I'm not sure if this is a wind gate test, but it looks something very, very similar to it. This is kind of max effort testing. It might be lactate threshold testing. I'm not quite sure what it is, but these tests are vicious. Vicious.
So there's a lot of kind of, when I say a lot, I mean like in the sports science community, there will be like a lot of silent arguments or like indirect arguments or thoughts going around on, is the Wingate test a good way of testing power? The way we'd kind of look at it is it's a very useful tool if you're consistent with it. So if you're lucky enough to go to a place that lets you do testing, or you've got equipment available for you that lets you do testing, if you do this at periodic points and you do the same thing every time throughout the year, it is valuable because the metric then allows you to see if there's changes. So if you're keeping the same measurement tool and you're approaching it with reasonably similar conditions each time, so you've rested, I don't know, for 2 days beforehand, and you've your same body weight and you've all your metrics, and then you apply it and you take it like at the start of the season, maybe at the middle of the season and the end of the season or off season or whatever points you're taking, it's pretty useful because you can see, you know, your measurement is consistent, and then you're looking at the differences in the values. Are you seeing an increase by the end of your off season, or did you see no changes, or did maybe even worse, did you see a reduction at the end of your off season? Or maybe halfway through your off season you saw an increase in power output, but then suddenly for some reason 6 weeks later you saw a reduction, and then you're looking, maybe was I overly fatigued, did I go too far with my volume, did I go too far in my intensity, did I change something in those second set of 6 weeks or something similar like that?
Yeah, I really like the idea of really consistent testing on multiple points throughout the year. In my experience, the consistency is the main thing that falls in.
Yeah.
Because most competitive athletes, even if they're not professional athletes, will do the testing, but it might be, they might do something like an aerobic capacity test on a Friday, having done a full week of pre-season running,
Yeah.
and then expect to get valuable results when they did their last test during the off season, when they had a week off beforehand. These, having done a lot of bike erg testing as a guinea pig myself, I'm getting PTSD just looking at this.
Also, the problem with this is there's actually a knack to doing those correctly, and they're kind of like a sport in of themselves. So you are going to get an observer effect or practitioner effect, really, from the initial few sessions if you do them. So there would be some...
There's definitely a bit of...
There's an argument made to train them a little bit also to get used to it or keep it consistently if you're going to use it as a testing method, which I think is kind of valuable, because testing is always super valuable as long as it's not majorly invasive. And I think if you kept these in once a week or so, or maybe once every 2 weeks or something, I think... But then it's the long-term data there.
Yeah.
Probably getting away from the subject of the video though a bit.
Yeah, that is, and we could probably finish on this. That is the kind of big debate now at the moment, is VO2 max testing for athletes who don't use a bike regularly. So like as a skier, you're not a biking athlete, and doing VO2 max testing on a bike versus doing that on a ski erg or something along those lines. So that is an interesting area that next 5 or 10 years is probably going to tell us a lot more than we know now.
So lastly, what we have a lot of is the presence of plyometrics. So the use of plyometrics, I think, has been very bastardized, and there's a lot of good arguments to say that there's a difference between plyometrics and jump training. Plyometrics, of course, is as fast as possible, minimal ground contact time when it comes to lower body plyometrics. Very often it's unweighted, or it should be unweighted for most scenarios. But in the cases of alpine skiing, one of the things you'll see in the literature is the idea that power endurance is something that manifests itself compared to other athletes, or the better athletes seem to have better power endurance. And so that's the ability, obviously, as the name suggests, to put out power consistently over a longer period of time, rather than maybe a weightlifter or a long jumper who does it immediately but couldn't really repeat that too many times. The idea for an alpine skier is lots of power, or the right amount of power, as consistently over an extended period of time. Of course, an extended period of time for power endurance is 60 seconds or 30 seconds, or maybe for a weightlifter 10 seconds.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So like critical power is massive in the real endurance sports, like the ultras, triathlons, sprint triathlons. Critical power, your ability to produce a certain amount of power forever without ever stopping. Like you're utilizing lipids as your main fuel source. Obviously the other fuel sources are kicking in as well, but critical power would mean I can put out a certain amount of wattage on a treadmill, on a bike, on whatever erg. I can do that indefinitely until I run out of body fat or I die. There are they're not called critical power, but you can view your sport, whatever it might be, whether it's skiing or sprinting or weightlifting, you can view a value for you, a kind of critical power per se for your particular sport, as being, okay, in her case, she knows each corner requires a certain amount of power. It might be 2G, or it might be 5G, whatever it is, the amount of force being pushed upon you, you need enough power to be able to push back against it. You know the duration of the race, so you know these races take 30 to 60 seconds. I'm going to need that level of power output, that amount of work within that time. I think that is one thing that many athletes could do better, is make that a small but more specific, or maybe make that a focus of their training a bit more, rather than having the super broad kind of almost off-season style training when they're approaching competition. As they approach, they could probably get a lot more specific. And in this case, we see 4 jumps or 5 jumps in a row, I'm not sure how many, with a weighted vest. I assume the weighted vest is to emulate roughly the kind of force output she's going to have on each turn. That's very, very well suited then to her particular event.
Yeah, so that's the idea. When we hear power training, we always assume that we're looking for maximum power output for that athlete, or trying to improve it as much as possible, like we would for weightlifters or similar. But it might not always be the case. There's probably a little bit of context. However, one of the major and overriding aspects when we're doing plyometric training, or we're trying to improve that stretch shortening reflex, is the idea that we're doing the movement as fast as possible. And a lot of time, if we add weight, any amount of external weight, we're looking at, massively reducing the power output of our lower body. So if we have even like 2 kilo dumbbells or a 5 kilo weighted vest, while not that much an ability to produce force like in a back squat, as soon as we start jumping with that, we do dampen the power output. So it is important to pay attention to what are your power production needs for your particular sport. And are you doing weighted jumps because you think, I'm going to do weighted jumps, I'm going to super compensate from the weighted jumps, and I'm going to jump higher when I take off the vest, which isn't the case? Or am I doing weighted jumps because I need more ground reactive forces, and so that you see that going up when we add weighted vests or we add dumbbells or whatever it is? The more weight we add, external weight we add to the body jumping, you end up getting more ground reactive forces, which in some cases might be beneficial if you're doing it for the right reason. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this S&C Coaches React. As I said at the start, if you have any athletes you want to see us react to, please leave them in the comments below, and we will absolutely get to them if there's enough videos of them training, especially if it's a different sport, but we'll cover the same sports we've done before, no problem, as long as it's someone different. And ideally, if they have a lot of stuff, that would be great, but even if not, leave it below. Even if you don't know, and we'll have a look and investigate.
Today's video was brought to you by the Seek a Strength off-season strength and hypertrophy program. If you're an athlete in your off-season, be that a field sports athlete, be that a multi-sport athlete, you're looking to gain some strength and some extra muscle mass, this is the perfect program for you. There's 2 blocks available. Each block is 4 weeks in length, 4 sessions per week. Shoot us an email if you have any questions. Ask the questions in the comments down below. It's available in the description of this video.